TriCaster system. So they're in the process of trying to get everything coordinated. So far, we haven't been able to resume our monitor so we can see what's going on, and haven't been able to always get it going out live.
Well, I've done 2 shows with Ryan.
I have to tell you, I'm a little hard of hearing.
Yeah.
And I have to prefer a good hearing aid.
Okay. We're now beginning C.A.B.B. notes for March 2015. And today, as you could see, the topic is the practice and promise of public protest. Part of the reason for this conversation now, of course, is the 50th anniversary of the Selma demonstrations. And also, I was thinking of the veto by President Obama of the Keystone XL pipeline, and Bill McKibben saying, well, because of all these people out protesting, that's why he was able to get the courage to veto that project at this point. So we have an awesome panel today, and I thank everybody for coming. So I suppose maybe the first thing to do is just go down the line, and each of you could just express what your most optimistic feelings are about demonstrations you've been in, or what you think is working now. So why don't we start with Ellen down there? Ellen.
Hi, well, I'm Ellen Vierick, and I've lived in Bennington since 1954. Came here from Alaska, but grew up in Connecticut. And I taught school for many years at Molly Stark School. I also did a lot of lobbying in Montpelier, and I also worked very hard with the Forest Service to get more wilderness areas incorporated into the Green Mountain National Forest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think demonstrations have helped a great deal. My husband took part in the March on Washington when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech.
Wow.
I was there for another March on Washington regarding choice, women's choice. And I think demonstrations do work. I hope they do. They seem to. They seem to. A lot's happened since then.
Annette?
And I'm Annette Smith. I'm Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment, which is based in Danby. We've been involved in a whole variety of issues in Vermont, very few of which have lent themselves to demonstrations or protests. But one in particular that I'll focus on today is the wind issue, and what it is about that issue that actually caused people to come up and demonstrate on top of a mountain. And I have seen the tremendous value of protesting, especially in terms of getting media attention. And for places where you would never have any media, they show up and they like a sign. We dealt with a big quarry proposal in Danby, and I remember I was telling everybody we were having a press conference, and we said, nobody brings signs. We don't want to show like we're just opposing things. Well, somebody made a lovely stop sign with it. And of course, that was what got on the front page of the paper.
Yes.
So it was fine that happened, actually. But still, there very clearly was a benefit, and I've seen it over and over again, that where an event might not get any media attention. Now, how it affects politicians, well, they don't like seeing things on the front page of the paper and make that go away. So I'm quite optimistic about it as a tool, as part of a larger strategy. I think there are some places where it's sort of a waste of time, and I do find myself questioning it. So I'm glad to be on this panel and explore those areas where it may not be as relevant or useful.
Yeah, thank you. Andy?
Yeah, my name's Andrew Shirkey. I live in Shaftesbury. I'm a retired naval officer, and I have been working with the Will Miller Green Mountain chapter of Veterans for Peace for many years now. And I've been involved in demonstrating for peace and justice for over 30 years by now, beginning with the outrages committed by our former President Reagan and his secret wars in Central America. I protested and marched against those. I protested and marched against the war that was started by President George W. Bush. I marched and protested, demonstrated against the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, otherwise known as drones, I marched and demonstrated against my country's use of torture inflicted upon captured combatants during the global war on terror. So I think the purpose of my demonstrating and marching was to express my personal feelings against the policies of my government. I only wish that there were many more people who participated in voicing their objections to those policies. Perhaps in the future, we will be able to see that happen.
Yes, on that point, I think it was really startling to me to see, when they had that the shooting there in France a couple months ago, how many people come out to demonstrate for that?
Hundreds of thousands.
Thousands
Yeah.
and thousands.
Yeah, it's such a big difference between United States, it seems, and some of these other countries, especially European countries. What do you folks think about that disparity?
Well, I think may depend upon a number of things, and you raised an important point. I guess perhaps you're referring to what's happening nowadays, but I very well remember when literally millions of people in this country and an estimated maybe 23 million people around the world marched against the intended attack and invasion of Iraq. There were 500,000 people on the streets of Washington, D.C. in October of 2002. There were another 500,000 people marching in New York City in February in opposition to that. As we now know, the administration had already decided to attack Iraq way back before those demonstrations. But the numbers of people, the outcry made no difference on the Bush administration.
Well, in Europe has a long history of protest, and I remember as a history major the revolutions of 1848, which sparked revolution in major cities and countries all throughout Europe.
Yeah.
So they have city squares. They have a sort of a layout that lends itself to a lot of people coming out of cities and filling a town square or something. We have that with the mall in Washington. So one of the things you have to think about when you're doing protesting is logistics and how is it going to work? How are you going to get all the people there? And so it can be a challenge, and some of our cities are more lent towards it than others. But that was one of the protests, the demonstrations against the buildup to the Iraq War. It was one of those areas where I wondered, is there really any point to this? Because they've already made up their minds. They're not going to do any good. And one of my sort of strategy guidelines is do nothing which is of no use. And so I was thrilled to see it happen. On the other hand, it was pretty clear it wasn't going to make any difference. So I don't know. That was one that.
Well, at least it makes one feel better. You want to do something.
Yeah.
And I think it maybe has prevented some revolutions because at least we're demonstrating.
It gives some outlet.
Yeah,
Other than
it is
violence.
a kind of a safety valve.
I think not only that, but I'm convinced that it helps to raise awareness.
I think it does, yes, because a
throughout.
lot of people are just
And
totally
admittedly,
unaware.
frequently the press coverage does not do any justice to the numbers or the intent of people who
Yeah.
engage
Right.
in those kinds of demonstrations.
right.
But the raising of awareness, I think, is a very, very critical issue with
Well, an awful lot of
demonstrating.
people don't read the newspaper, and if they see it on television and it's pretty spectacular, it must make some difference.
Right, yeah, you get these views of just a whole street full of people with hundreds of signs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a point I'd like to stress is that the Second Amendment to our Constitution gives the people the right to express themselves in peaceful assembly,
Yes.
and that is exactly what all the demonstrations that I've participated in have amounted to.
Yes. Me
Notwithstanding the fact that more often than not, marchers are met with resistance,
Yeah.
sometimes violently, but very often they are met with resistance, and local authorities will frequently see fit to arrest many demonstrators for participating in
Yes,
acts of peaceable assembly
which
to
is
express their opinion.
unconstitutional. Yeah.
We just had a case in Montpelier where people occupied the governor's offices on the 5th floor.
Uh-huh.
And then another protesting in the State House over it was by the Vermont Workers' Center about the canceling of single payer.
Yes.
And both of those have led to policies like there was an art gallery up in the governor's office that's been shut down. There's talk about putting more security around the State House. And so the reaction that we see to some of these otherwise, peaceful civil disobedience is a little over the top compared to what the actions really are. Very peaceful people, nobody trying to hurt anything, and people getting arrested. Now, the charges against all of the people who occupied the governor's office over the natural gas fracked pipeline were all those charges were dismissed. So was it necessary to arrest people? I don't know. And they certainly made their point, and they were very, very well behaved. But did you have to close the art gallery and shut down a whole opportunity for artists? I mean, it's So there are these unintended consequences that come from it, but it does, especially in that case, really help to raise awareness prior to the election.
Yeah, frequently my experience has been that charges that are brought against peaceable demonstrators are based on how shall I put it, an elastic interpretation of the law. But quite often the charges are very vague things like disturbing the peace or disorderly conduct or demonstrating without a permit and all those kind of things. So it's a challenge. It's a test, I think,
Trespass.
for people to trespassing.
Yeah.
It's a test and a challenge for people to literally put themselves on the line for what they believe in.
Right. Well, you can also do it as an individual if you can't get up a group. I've been driving a car for many years. In fact, it's been a succession of cars that are covered with blatant bumper stickers, one of which says, "Eat more kale." Other peaceable things are buy local, but also, of course, political bumper stickers for various candidates and opinions about things. And
it's an interesting point about how you don't, recently Bill McKibben spoke at Green Mountain College. This was a few months ago.
he's wonderful.
Well, this particular issue didn't make me think so.
Oh, okay.
Because he was asked by apparently a member of the audience, and this was quoted in the paper, and I also got a report from someone who was there, what can we do? What can I as an individual do? And McKibben's answer apparently was there's nothing you can do as an individual. You have to join a group. Well, I have seen so many times when one person has made a difference. So I just think that was really bad advice, that maybe based on his experience, but over and over and over again, I see one person making a difference. And certainly on the wind issue, that one, some people, they decide they're going to protest, they're going to get all the logistics arranged in advance, and they're going to do it. What happened with the Lowell wind protest wasn't like that at all. It was very much individuals deciding and really grappling with their consciences. And it grew organically, and it didn't happen because somebody said, let's protest. The root of it was actually the Public Service Board setting a setback for a 459-foot tall tower of 196 feet from the neighboring property line. Now, these things do fall over. They catch fire. They throw ice. They throw blades. It's this is a simple, basic issue. And they've done this for all the wind projects that have been approved. They've approved a setback of less than 200 feet. And in this particular case, there was one landowner who had joined 1.5 miles of the property line and alleged that the man who owned the land where the wind project was being built had actually taken land from them to enable the wind project on what was otherwise a very narrow strip of land. And so after it was approved and after I was still fuming over this setback issue, because the setback all around the country is 1.1 times the total height. Or if you have ice throw as an issue, it's 1.5 times. So this was just a really bad policy to have been supporting. And I have worked on quarry issues, so I thought, well, the landowners next door have a right to use their land.
Yeah.
What if somebody put tents up on the mountain? They're planning to use 750,000 pounds of explosives up on the mountain. They actually probably used more. So what are they going to do at this pinch point where they are going to blast a 25-foot cut? What are they going to do if somebody puts tents up there? Now, the idea was simply to put tents with no trespassing signs. How would they know anybody was in them or not? They would have to assume somebody was in them. Well, this mountain had been used by the Sterling College students out of Craftsbury for 20-some years as their outdoor wilderness experience. So I went to Dick's Sporting Goods and bought $80 worth of tents and some no trespassing signs, and a bunch of guys went up and put them up. Well, the next thing we know, the Sterling College students are making a campsite. There are people spending the night there. People are going up, and it's a rugged hike up to the top of that mountain.
Really?
And it ended up with first two students getting arrested by accident after Green Mountain Power freaked out and said, wait a minute, we can't have this. And so they went to Superior Court and got a temporary restraining order on a Friday afternoon to keep the landowners off their own land for 1,000 feet from their property line. In other words, they basically seized 200 acres of this neighbor's property.
Good
So that
heavens.
they, for a blast zone, which they should have gotten through the Public Service Board process through a temporary easement. But no, they went to Superior Court, got this TRO, and it was in place. And it's this temporary restraining order is what you get when you're trying to protect a woman from being abused by her husband or something. It was completely outrageous. Every lawyer that they would come up to me at like art gallery opens and say, what was that judge thinking? So this turned into quite a scene, which we can explore a little more if you'd like to. But including Chris Braithwaite, who was the publisher of the Barton Chronicle, going up to cover what was going on up in the mountain, ending up getting arrested himself, and that even brought more publicity to it. So you had reporters hiking up to the top of this mountain to cover the protest that was going on.
Quite industrious.
And half a dozen people went up to get arrested, and I just want to read a little opening of what Chris wrote about his book. In the fall of 2011, while protesters were occupying Wall Street and the downtowns of cities in the world, a handful of people occupied a campsite atop a remote mountain in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. What were they thinking? 6 respectable adults, among them a physician, a college teacher, and a mason who covers cultural events for his local newspaper, put their bodies within range of heavy explosives and finally stepped in front of enormous pieces of construction equipment, including one of them was your son, to bring a major wind power project to a halt. They defied the police who arrested them when they refused to retreat. They defied the regulators who had approved the project after an intensive and open permitting process. They defied the verdict of the people of the town meeting, a form of direct democracy that can trace its roots to ancient Greece. They defied the considered judgment of Vermont's strong environmental community, and they defied a powerful corporation that was determined to brush them aside. Why they came to the conclusion that their mountain had to be saved from all these forces, and how 6 so different individuals finally agreed on the tactics they would employ is the subject of this book. And it's fascinating. He wanted to explore what would cause these otherwise upstanding community members to choose, and individually, each one grappled with it, and each one came to the same conclusion: they could not stand by and watch nothing happen.
Well, I think that's kind of a key point you made there, and that it's an individual choice. It's up to the individual to decide whether or not to take direct action,
Right.
and oppose the forces that they believe are doing damage or are illegal or dangerous or whatever. It's up to the individual to make that choice. If enough individuals make that choice, then perhaps there's a movement. Enough individuals in 1965 decided to cross a bridge over the Alabama River and at Selma, and that that continued a movement, of course, which had been started earlier, a nonviolent, peaceable march. And typically that is a hallmark of what many people engage in to express themselves individually. An individual feels moved by conscience to do something. He talks to a friend, and that's a dialogue. If those two people talk to other people, perhaps they form a group. And it's that kind of dynamic, I think, which has been the hallmark of what has provided significant changes in our society and culture, whether it's voting rights, whether it's civil rights, whether it's a women's vote. I mean, all of those kind of movements started with an individual talking to another individual.
So there was an initial wind project in Sheffield, and if you want to put on that first video, it shows a handful of people standing around the entrance of the Sheffield wind site. Well, again, these are extremely remote areas. This is nothing sensational, this video that's showing. It's it's a handful of people standing around a driveway. Not exactly an easy place to protest. So now the second video shows a winter scene looking down onto the protesters who are up on this mountain, half a dozen people who went up to get arrested. And when you think about it, you're up at 2,000 feet in elevation in the middle of nowhere. And, actually what happened the first time they tried to get arrested, which is about a week before the video that's showing, they, and you can, that's enough of that video. They went up there on a Saturday and they couldn't get any attention. So they talked about maybe they should order a pizza. And then, then the guard would know the pizza was getting, it wasn't really serious because nobody in Lowell delivers pizza, but still it was, it was one of those things. How do you get attention to what you're doing?
Oh.
So they went back on a work morning, and it was really quite intense. And that's when your son stepped in front of a bulldozer. There was actually, there were huge trucks going side by side up the mountain, and they had blasted these huge 25-foot cuts in the mountain and broke the hearts of people who care about the ecology of Vermont. And it's they had signs that said "Detour to an honest energy future," and so this just kept building and building and building. And now the next video, if you play that one, is of, I don't know how many people, 50 or 100 people went up on the top of the mountain in summer. They're square dancing. They're playing fiddle tunes. They do a little play. It looks fun, but on the other hand, you stop work, the whole media is there, half the police department is there. I mean, it's intense. And that's the sort of thing that just kept building and building and building. And now, might as well keep going. We'll go to the next video, which is about some people who climbed to the top of the Capitol Plaza in Montpelier and unrolled banners about how this was not green energy, this was not saving emissions, and they managed to get away without getting arrested. But it was that intense for people to want to make it, okay, let's take it off the mountain, let's take it into town, and let's make it visible for the governor to see, for everybody to see. This is not going away.
And that was protesting specifically what?
It was protesting specifically the Lowell Wind Project, but really all the wind projects in what a dishonest energy policy it is, and the destruction of the environment, and that they're selling the renewable energy credits out of state, so it's not renewable energy for Vermonters, and it's not saving emissions, and it's not reducing fossil fuel. In fact, it's using tremendous amounts of fossil. I mean, there were plenty of issues to talk about and articulate if anybody would talk. But the idea was, no, this is just good for the planet, and it's going to save the planet, and so anybody who's going against that is going against God. And so there were plenty of, but nobody wanted to have the conversation. So how do you have the conversation if nobody will talk to you? And that's when people are motivated to protest.
Well, I think sometimes protests can be for something rather than against something also. And I have participated in many small-scale such ones. I was in Vermont when they were debating the same-sex marriage issue, and I was in the committee room that finally decided to call it civil unions, and they had quite a time thinking up a name for it. And another time I went up to to support end of life choice.
Mhm.
My youngest daughter had a very unhappy, much too early death from colon cancer, and she luckily she worked as a nurse, and the whole nursing staff of the area where she worked all her life supported her, and but it helped, I think, to tell her story in the legislature and have them realize there are cases when this is very, very much needed.
Well, and to the idea that people are just opposing things. I mean, I think that the people
Yeah.
who were up on the Lowell Mountain would have said that they were proponents of
Yes.
mountain ecology. They're proponents of
Sure.
not
Of
fragmenting
course.
forests.
Yeah.
So they felt very motivated by their positive motives. And so again, we see with the media, it's about framing too. I'm so tired of being called an opponent of things when you know we're fighting for clean air, we're fighting for clean water, we're fighting for the wildlife habitat, we're
Of
fighting for
course.
the bald eagles that are being killed by the wind turbines, and
Yeah.
instead you're an opponent when you're fighting for some really core principles.
Right.
I think that's a very accurate observation, and that I think much of my efforts have been directed towards peace.
Yeah.
Right.
To tell a little anecdote. When I was in the Navy, the air station where I was, they ran patrol planes out over the Atlantic to track the Russian submarines. Okay, the Navy parlance was anti-submarine patrols, but those of us in my reserve unit decided we weren't against them. We were simply pro-surface.
Yeah.
to put a different, although humorous spin on it.
Well, and you were an anti-war protester. You're really a peace protester.
I'm a peace advocate.
Peace advocate,
I am
yeah.
a peace advocate. Regrettably, the authorities, local, state, national governments do not view us as being pro-peace people. We are anti-war people.
Well, I actually get into it with reporters, and I ask them to please stop calling us
Yeah,
opponents. And
good,
please,
good.
and I think that we can change this paradigm.
Yeah.
I mean, we still have a corporate-controlled media, but the walls are coming down.
Yeah.
And there is good media that gives us a voice. Vermont
Indeed.
Digger is an excellent
Yeah.
example
Yeah.
where we can
Yeah.
project our values in our own words. And you know,
What bothers me most is very often some rather sneaky projects are getting to be started because it hasn't been publicized. There's a Navy thing on the Olympic Peninsula right now where they're going to put, what do you call it, radio waves back and forth
the
all
HARP,
over the place.
the HARP antenna.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's going to cause all kinds of problems for, and the thing of sending off explosions in the ocean, which is killing seals and whales and
Yeah.
porpoises and everything else, and they wonder why they wash up on beaches. There's no wonder, and it's very hard where there should be a public protest to
How do you
get
do
one
it?
established.
Right.
I just read about that one on the Olympic Peninsula last week. And that's the national park up there. They're going to be doing it in a national park.
Well, speaking of that, as long as we're talking about national parks and your experience with wilderness, this is another sort of interesting opportunity.
Yes.
The U.S. Forest Service has approved a 30-turbine wind project on public lands in Bennington County in Reedsboro and Searsburg. And
Right next to the
Right next to
George
the George
Aiken
Aiken
Wilderness, and it should not be there.
and my organization has spent over $100,000 suing the Forest Service over that
Oh,
project.
really? I
and
didn't know that.
we lost the day before Christmas.
Oh.
Merry Christmas. Thank you, Judge Murtha. So it was a stunning decision because we had handed to a federal judge who's about to retire, or in retirement actually, the opportunity to at least talk about the value of wilderness. And his decision said, well, there will be impacts, but they won't be that bad. And from our take on it, it's going to be visible from numerous places within
Well,
the
they were going to be
wilderness.
so much bigger than the ones that are there
The
on
ones
the
that are
ridge
there
in
are-
Deerfield.
They're 197
Oh,
feet
different.
tall, and the ones that have been approved are,
What are they, 400
they
or
vary,
something, aren't they?
but they came back during our suit to actually increase the height of the ones closest to the wilderness, so we're up to a 417
That's what I
feet
was
tall.
thinking, yeah.
So now, in the question of protesting, one of the things that made the Lowell project gave the ability to protest was that it was a rare opportunity where you actually had a neighboring landowner so close that had access to get up on the mountain. This is public service.
This is all on
public land.
yeah.
And
it's
so
appalling.
again, it's a very remote location. It's not in the middle of a metropolis where are people going to have that same idea? It's also critical bear habitat, which the
Very
Vermont
critical bear habitat.
Fish and Wildlife
that's
Department
really
testified
gonna
it would destroy the genetically
It's one of the
distinct
few-
species. But does anybody care? We
The power company cares.
power, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and the Forest Service is vehemently, aggressively in favor of this.
Really?
Absolutely. And so even though we raised very good issues, including a lot of conflict of interest issues that were blatant, it was really shocking to have that. And so this was not a fair case at all. They used the same experts for aesthetics and noise as the wind company, Iberdrola, one of the largest multi-billion-dollar energy companies in the world,
from
from
Portugal.
Spain. From Spain. This one's a
Is it
Spanish
Spain?
company. Yeah. They use the same experts. The Forest Service used the same experts as the company used during the permitting process
And that's
for
ridiculous.
the Public Service Board. I mean, on its face, there were a lot of issues. And when you get these decisions that just say no to everything, then it's a political fix, and somebody's
yeah,
working on ideology rather than law.
Yeah.
And again, that's when it inspires people to protest. So there is a neighboring landowner to this site. He's probably happy to have people walk through his property to get up to the mountain. Are people going to be inclined to try and push the limits of what's possible? I don't know. It's not something that I don't think anybody can plan. Again, it comes down to individual motivations.
Well, I had a very rude encounter, I must say, with one of our previous governors who decided at the last minute, after we'd been negotiating, all the pros and con groups had been negotiating together for over 5 years with the Forest Service regarding the wilderness area. And it was all settled. And we'd made numerous compromises. And all the different groups had settled this. And then suddenly, Governor Douglas decided to withhold 6,200 acres along the road between Wardsboro and Arlington, just willy-nilly, all of a sudden. He said, well, we've got to have some compromise. I said, Governor, we've been compromising with all the interested groups, pro and con, for 5 years. Where have you been? I was not very polite, as I frequently am not. But anyway,
Well,
Well,
I
and
guess it held, and he kept out those 6,200 acres.
And now this particular wind project sets a precedent where if you can put 400-foot tall wind turbines on U.S. Forest Service land next to a wilderness, that they already have scoped out 30 sites in Vermont in the Green Mountain National Forest.
Well,
some
I
of
think
which are
we've
next
got to have some
wilderness.
change in Forest Service leadership in order to fight this, and
We've
I don't
seen
know how
every-
you bring it about.
We've seen every federal agency roll over for these wind projects.
Yeah.
National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service. It's a political agenda.
yeah, it
This-
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
all based on the false question of renewable energy.
Yes.
Well, and when you've exhausted every angle, whether it's regulatory or legal, I think that's when you get protest,
Yes.
and that's when it it can make a difference. Now, the Lowell Wind Project didn't get stopped. On the other hand, we haven't seen any new ones proposed,
Right.
and the overwhelming message is learn from Lowell. Don't repeat the same mistakes.
Well, I think that's key to
That's one of the
Make-
bumper stickers on my refrigerator.
yeah.
Make new mistakes.
Yeah,
Good one.
yeah. Well, I think that's key in it. Raise awareness. I mean, the Lowell project is the vehicle, I think, to raise awareness.
Yes.
And if enough people become aware of these kinds of issues, and they have to make a personal choice. And
I mean,
whatever
superficially,
that
it sounds
choice
like a
is,
good
if
thing,
they-
but they don't realize the drawbacks.
If
Well,
they-
what the
if-
other one of the things that the mountain occupiers did was that they held open houses every month too, and so that a lot of people who were in favor of wind hiked up that mountain, which is a long hike. I've done it a couple times, and in really rough conditions sometimes, and they were shocked by what they saw. And so it is that, giving people access to seeing what was going on. A lot of people walked down off that mountain, completely changed their minds, and it wasn't
Well, I
because
think
you
it's
talked
the
to them.
scale that really troubles people. I've talked to some of my neighbors regarding putting up a wind tower that could be shared amongst 3 or 4 families and farms in my neighborhood in West Shaftesbury, and that wouldn't bother anybody. They were quite interested in it. I haven't followed through on it, but
Well,
I have a good site for it in my hayfield where it gets good access to the west wind,
Yeah.
northwest wind, which is our dominant wind.
I think perhaps maybe a misapprehension is that, perhaps not to engage in assumptive thinking, but perhaps people think that, wow, renewable energy, that's really cool. And yeah, they can put a big wind turbine up there on this mountain, and that's going to be renewable energy, and that means I'm not maybe going to have to either pay so much for power or something, but a closer examination, you discover whose power is it that's being generated and where is it going? Is it going to help local people? Not only no, but heck no.
Well, the other
Well-
problem is that it's destroying people's lives, and so it's making people
It is.
sick. Now, we have one other video that would be worth playing right now, and it's one of a handful of people standing outside the pavilion office building. And it was because of all the uproar over the wind issue and the fact that there are literally dozens of people living around these 3 projects, and also the Huzak Wind Project in Massachusetts, who are sick, who can't sleep at night, who wake up in the middle of the night with panic attacks. And so the Public Service Board opened a sound standard investigation. And the first one was very dry and boring, and I looked around the room and I'm like, boy, if everybody would sit around the table and talk instead of like just listening to presentations, we might get somewhere. The second one was for the public, and it was so abusive because the wind proponents had pulled out neighbors who were actually, many of them, on the payroll of the wind companies or had some financial interest. It was a brutal public hearing. It was the most painful thing I've sat through. So the third one, a bunch of us boycotted. I won't go in there again. I just couldn't do it. And so the video that we showed is of, well, Bread and Puppet has been wonderful up
Oh,
in the
yeah,
Northeast Kingdom.
yeah.
And so they bring
Yeah.
music and drums and dancing. And we were at the entrance of the Public Service Board, maybe, half a dozen or so people. Well, that was an event that the first 2 hearings never got covered by the press. But because there were people protesting outside, guess what? It got news stories. It got news stories before the hearing even happened. Why were people protesting? And so that's been it's been a really interesting lesson to learn.
Yeah,
that-
well, that's to raise awareness and get that kind of coverage is key, I think, to overcoming the unjust practices of government, of government.
And each of the public service members had to walk by this and
Yeah.
see the signs
Yeah,
and
yeah.
confront the fact that there were people there whose lives had been destroyed
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
what they had approved, and they're not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
Even their sound standard investigation was to address new projects, and they're not dealing with what's happening to the people who they have
I
permitted
noticed
to be
there's a
harmed.
pretty tall single wind tower up on the mountain in Pownell. And of course, there's a bunch of them up in Florida, Massachusetts.
That's the Huzak Wind Project. That one is really painful. You go down and sit in the house with the neighbors there, and it's really, really sad.
Well, it surprises me that they're causing so much problem. I have been up to the ones in Searsburg several times. I walked up there and stood with my hand on the tower, and I couldn't even feel it vibrating hardly, just barely.
Well, I think that's what
And
most
it wasn't
Vermonters
making any noise.
Yeah, most Vermonters think of when they think of wind turbines as those, and that's why there's a lot of support. What I've had to learn way more than I wanted to, and that we're talking about protesting,
Yeah.
so I won't go into this too much. But there was just recently a study out of Australia that was commissioned by the wind company of a really fine acoustician, and he identified what we've all been learning is that it's not audible noise. It is a sensation. And so every time these huge blades pass the tower, it puts out what's called amplitude modulation. So it goes whoosh, 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 and it's pressurizing the air and sending out these barometric pressure waves. So you're getting
Oh,
whoosh,
really?
whoosh.
Uh-huh.
NASA's known about this infrasound issue since the 1980s, and the developers have known about it, and they've managed to rig all the regulators around the world. It's been really impressive to see how they've done it,
Wonderful.
so that they are using only audible decibel levels in 1/3 octave bands, neither of which this expert found correlated with what the people were experiencing. And the symptoms are the same everywhere around the world. They're
Yeah.
serious. It's a disaster for any community, but not everybody's affected. People are affected differently, and so then you get into these neighbor things, and well, I love getting the money in my town, so I don't care if you're sick. So it's not pleasant.
Oh dear.
Well,
On the subject of the value of
complicated.
protesting, let's talk about Vermont Yankee,
Oh, that's a big one.
because
Yes.
About what?
Vermont Yankee,
Oh, yes.
because we saw just fabulous protesting.
Yes.
I didn't participate. It's over on the other side of the state, and there were enough people doing it. I didn't need to. But in the end, the idea is they shut the plant because of economics. So none of what people did mattered. So what do you think? Did it matter?
it mattered to the people that protested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And absolutely. It got them out of their house. It got them out of the pews. It got them out there to make a statement.
And get
make a
arrested.
statement.
90-some-year-old women
well,
getting arrested
well, whatever.
repeatedly.
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. And, yeah, it made a difference. It made a difference, I think, for sure.
My eldest daughter has protested many times on our nuclear test site out in Nevada.
Yeah,
And,
that's a bad one.
They were kept out in the hot sun
Wow.
without any kind of protection and were not
Yeah.
allowed water all day.
Yeah.
And they managed to live through that several times.
Yeah.
And
Last weekend, there was a protest out near there, conducted by the Nevada Desert Experience in conjunction with Code Pink and Veterans for Peace to shut down an Air Force base that was a key base for the drone operations in the Middle
oh
East.
yeah, this
Uh,
drone thing scares me to death.
Well, yeah, there's a group that I demonstrated with at the Hancock base outside of Syracuse. That's another drone base, and there's a local group there. Well, actually, it's an upstate coalition to stop the drone killing, and they're raising public awareness to the extent that, from what I've seen, the local court is beginning to listen
Oh, that's
to
good.
what these people are doing and why they are doing it.
Yeah,
A
that's,
couple of years ago, there was a protest there. 31 of us decided to risk arrest, part of that demonstration, and we were charged with the usual slew of vague charges, something called obstructing government administration, whatever. And in fact, the base commander had convinced the court that all of us would be subject to an order of protection, because the base commander convinced the court that he feared for his safety. And as we mentioned earlier, these orders of protection are intended to protect victims of domestic abuse. Okay.
yeah.
Well, I can tell you so far for the trials, it's been a parade of peace activists, some of which were mature people. Let me put it politely. People even in their 80s. People.
Heavens.
There one
Gosh.
protester was using a
Well,
walker.
I'm almost 87.
There were 3 of them using canes, and these are the people that the base commander feared for his personal safety.
Oh, Lord.
Okay, this stuff began to get ink in the local press, and
That begins to sound pretty ridiculous. doesn't it?
misdemeanor where it's a jury trial in the state of New York, a jury of 6 people. Well, these protesters, okay, they're testifying, and with the exception, I think, of one person, the jury acquitted them, or the judge, in fact, gave them conditional release. Okay, I mean, this is in response to an outrageous act of the application of a law,
Yeah.
and that's what it's about.
Oh wow.
And I'm still awaiting my trial date, but the whole issue, it brings to the whole issue protesting and demonstrating to the forefront. If I, in 2005, if I demonstrate in front of the White House, probably the most regulated piece of real estate in the world, if I demonstrate out there and to protest against my government's torture policy, okay, almost 400 of us get busted. If I demonstrate against the war, 12 of us get busted here in Bennington. You know, and it's those kinds of response that really worry me about how the whole mindset of the country, particularly those in authority, those in positions of power, are responding. We have reports that the FBI is infiltrating peace groups. They're infiltrating
I heard
Occupy
about that.
Wall Street.
Well, and they're going after fracking protesters.
Fracking, quote, environmental terrorist. What future president is going to decide, for whatever reason, that if you're protesting some government policy, then you're a terrorist? I mean,
Oh, boy.
and
Right.
I fear for the Constitution, quite frankly. And
Well, this whole
that's
thing
why
about
what I do,
fracking
I do.
really disturbs me, because this is going to, I mean, pure drinking water is rapidly becoming the new gold. And if we get that pipeline going from Canada, where they're fracking to get the oil out of rocks, and then they're going to pipe it down across our prime pasture land and grain lands out
Yeah.
west, and then take it down to the Gulf to be purified, and then it's going overseas. It's not even for our own use that we're
Well,
endangering all
yeah.
these people along the pipeline.
That brings up a point, I think, Alan. We've seen the reports of the opposition in Congress against the president's non-approval of the Keystone XL pipeline.
Yeah,
And the movement in Congress to overturn the president's decision
yeah.
is hand in hand with lots of people in Congress.
But they failed. The
But
Senate
they failed. But my point is that at what point will they not fail that kind of action?
Well, and the
They'll
fact
keep
is that there
Congress-
are a lot of pipelines already built while the XL one is being fought. There's all these
Well,
other
look at how
ones
many
too.
spills they've had in the Arctic.
Yeah, my
frightening.
issue
And
here
those aren't
is
cleanable.
elected representatives.
Yeah.
You know, deciding based on whatever their motives are, and I won't
Well,
go
I
into
think
that. But
the
the
really
whole,
tragic
let me
thing is the
finish.
lack
Let
of
me-
voting.
Yeah, and I'm also seeing at the same time a lot of congressmen, 47 senators, are conjuring up regulation to overturn the president's negotiations with Iran to try to
This
It's
is
not going
awful.
too well either.
and at what point does that kind of
Yeah.
power turn against the people?
The balance in our government is
I'm
getting
seeing a
very
whole
skewed.
militarization of our society.
Yes,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, I'm seeing people rising up over things all the time. We just had an interesting experience here in Bennington over the issue of adding fluoride to the water,
Yes.
where really the town armored up in favor of it, and it was up to the people to come to their own decision about whether or not they wanted to add what is
Yeah, I was
essentially
very
an
proud of them.
industrial waste chemical to their water, and they voted overwhelmingly no. And so there are these, I see pockets of light everywhere because things have become so outrageous. And I'm so tired of being outraged. And I'm tired of fighting, and I'm very good at it. And that's not how I want to live my life. It's not how I live my life, but it's how I do my work. And it's not anything that I want to do. But what are you going to do when you keep batting your head against the wall until your head bleeds and nobody cares? So I do see that everything is changing.
And,
That we have all kinds of opportunities now coming up, groundswell, to take back our rightful democracy.
and,
Well, I think the young people have got to be gotten back into the voting group. They got Obama elected, and then they sort of subsided.
well, that's
We need to get
that's
them
true.
activated
Yeah,
again
yeah.
for these issues.
Regarding the protests in 1956, I swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I will continue to do that. I will continue
Right.
to resist these illegal actions of my government that are unconstitutional. They are violating treaty after treaty.
Right.
They are starting war after war, and I will continue to oppose that. I
Well,
will oppose that. I will continue to advocate for peace as actively and as strongly as I can.
Well, our nuclear test site is on an Indian reservation,
Oh, yeah.
which we promised to protect, and we totally ignored.
Wind projects, Alcatillo Wind, built on Native American burial ground of the sort where it's an arid landscape, so they would leave people out to decompose. Completely sacred ground. Totally just bulldozed.
Well, I've been
over.
kind of amused by the fact that they are now becoming the proprietors of numerous large gambling casinos to take our money back from us.
Well, very
and
creative.
I'm saying hooray for you.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
Well, yeah, they can do that. Yeah, but protesting, I think, is a privilege that's sacrosanct in the American culture. It's been legislated as part of our Constitution, and no matter what government authority, no matter what president is in power,
Got to be protected.
it has to be protected.
Yes.
It has to be protected actively.
We had another
Yes.
interesting issue with protesting around the wind issue. There was Sheffield, way up in the very remote area. There's Lowell, again, not quite as remote, but still very remote. Well, then Grandpa's Knob got proposed. That's outside of Rutland, Pittsford, Castleton. The folks up there you might sort of call, I don't know, hippie, crunchy, granola types. I don't know. I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but there was a sort of an image about them. Well, the folks around Grandpa's Knob, these were families, these were the working class Vermonters. And they turned out to protest all over the place.
That's wonderful.
And they showed up to protest a Bernie Sanders event. Now, Bernie Sanders he actually yelled at wind opponents. He was, absolutely, at a protest that they held at a Democratic Party thing. He came out and stopped and yelled at them. Well, then he gets confronted with basically his people, right? And they were very determined. They had CDs to give him. They had things they'd written to give him. They talked to him. In the public meeting portion of it in a church, his people wouldn't get that, because the wind opponents all were wearing shirts that identified who they were, would not give the microphone to the people. Bernie finally said, to his credit, give those people the microphone.
Good.
After that, we saw Bernie Sanders say, well, there are problems. Don't pretend there aren't. So just the right people in the right place at the right time. No amount of intellectual discussion or facts or information where it's going to sway him. But when he saw mothers with children, when he saw sleeveless men with tattoos, big bulky guys, when he saw worker types out there protesting him, that got his attention.
Well, that certainly is a credit to our senator, and I have to applaud the actions of all three of our congressional representatives.
We're wonderfully
for
represented, I
taking
think.
to making a stand against authorizing a new war. They are opposed to that kind of legislation, which the Congress is considering even as we speak, at the behest of our president, Mr. Obama.
Yeah.
And all three of them are on record as opposing that.
Right. Yeah.
Even though I have to admit that they kind of, and it's part of the dilemma for me, because I really don't understand how an elected representative, even people like our congressional delegation, can go on year after year voting for and approving the outrageous amount of money
Military
that this
budget,
country spends on the military.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Over 50% of the discretionary budget gets spent on military, either
And
directly
about 3%
or indirectly.
on education.
3% on education, maybe 5% on medical.
And they don't
It's-
even account for it.
No.
And
no,
that's
they don't.
just what's on the books. There's all
Yeah.
this off-book
It's
stuff,
all
too.
a lot of stuff is off the books, under
Well,
the table. It's carried
The
over
whole
year
thing
after
of
year.
the CIA budget being totally
It's black.
black.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that is outrageous.
We in 1970, this country ratified a thing called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty,
Yes.
and the intent was to stop other countries from getting the bomb.
Yeah.
And the inherent in that treaty, and part of it, is the pledge of the nations that had the bomb to work to eliminate them.
Right.
Right.
Last year, President Obama requested and got approved $1 trillion to rebuild and improve our current nuclear arsenal. And we're sitting here looking at the
ridiculous.
roads, the bridges destroyed, our children without an education.
Yeah.
People cannot get a higher education.
Well,
It's
how about
outrageous.
how many
It's
homeless
outrageous.
we have in this richest of all countries?
And now they
It's
want
appalling.
now they want to budget $5 billion for a new war in the Middle East. And where's growing up in World War II, it was endemic. The whole country was that. Frequently, it's called the last good war. But we were attacked. Now, our defense strategy is based on protecting American interests.
Well, it's also based on how much money the people who are involved on the outside are making off of war.
Well,
War is
Right.
really
big
an economic
Yeah.
vehicle,
Oh,
and
yeah.
so
People
that's
make
that's
millions out of
what a lot of
war.
these wars are based on. Is really
The defense industry has meticulously engineered it, I believe, so that every congressional district in this country has some kind of a war-making interest in
Right.
it.
right.
Even our
That's
own,
right.
even our own congressional demonstration, they're all for basing the latest, most advanced,
F-35.
most expensive piece of military hardware ever invented. They're all for basing it in Burlington. Why? Because it's going to bring jobs.
well, and Lockheed Martin has managed to get economic activity around this plane in
Ooh,
so
yeah.
many states
That's it.
that everybody's
That's it.
got a piece of the
And-
puzzle.
Regrettably, I don't think we're ever going to get away from the war economy. We're
Yeah.
going to be in a state
Oh,
of
I'm
of
an
a-
optimist.
of
I
a per-
believe we are going to. I think the system's crumbling. I don't see it able to hold itself up.
no red-blooded, self-respecting congressman is ever going to vote for eliminating a job in his district. And I
No.
think that's what it's about.
Well-
Even as President Eisenhower saw it in 1960.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's with us. It's built in.
What he said has come to pass.
Indeed. Yeah.
Well, I really applaud both of you for the larger issues that you take on. I come at it from a very different perspective in that I feel like I know I can have an impact on the ground. And Vermont is such a small state that it makes it possible for
Yeah.
for people to
Yeah.
have an
Yes, your
impact.
vote really makes a difference in Vermont.
so
That's one wonderful thing about it.
That's where I've focused my energies
Yeah,
is on
yeah.
places where I know
Yeah.
I can see the results. You know, a project I was working on for the last few weeks got withdrawn yesterday. It was a stupid project. Great, you know, see the immediate results, and then the opportunity for taking that area and turning it into something positive.
Well, I counted 37 lime sludge cars coming from Omia's thing parked across the.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't get home in North Bennington because it was parked across the railroad tracks with all the lights flashing. And I sat there and I sat there and I sat there and I counted 37 cars full of that stuff.
Well, people are becoming, I think, more and more aware of the bomb trains that travel through this country.
And the
It's waiting. Every other week, one of these things derails, explodes.
tar sands oil.
You know,
Yep.
it's tar
Yeah.
sands oil. It's
Yep.
what it is.
West Virginia.
Yeah.
It's what it is. And the people in Albany are living in fear because those
There's
trains
a whole
are
lot of the
parked
low
right
income
along.
housing is right
Yeah,
beside the railroad
it's right
tracks.
downtown, for heaven's sake.
Well, they go up
you know?
both sides of Lake Champlain
Yeah,
too. So
yeah.
Well, I think we've found that we have plenty to protest against still, right? Okay.
Oh, yes, there's never a
no, I'm protesting
of-
for something.
Yes,
Nathan.
I'm for-
I'm for a peace
All
and
right, that's the
justice. I mean, that's
optimism.
what I'm about.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here.
A pleasure.
Well,
And
Thank
peace
you,
be with
honored
you.
to be asked. Thank you.